If you've ever gotten close to something you wanted and then quietly pulled away from it without fully understanding why, you're not alone. Maybe it looked like procrastination or suddenly losing motivation right before things started working out, or finding a small flaw in something good and focusing on it until it didn't feel worth it anymore. From the outside, it can look confusing. Why would someone work towards something and then get in their own way? But from the inside, it doesn't feel like sabotage. It feels like something else. It feels like hesitation, like discomfort, like something doesn't sit right, even if everything is technically going well. And that feeling usually doesn't come out of nowhere. It starts earlier than most people think. Sometimes in quiet moments that didn't seem important at the time. A child bringing home something they were proud of and getting a distracted response. A teenager trying something new and being met with subtle criticism. A household where success wasn't fully celebrated or where standing out felt unsafe. Nothing dramatic, just small patterns. But the mind pays attention to patterns. And over time, it begins to associate certain experiences with certain outcomes. So if success once led to pressure, or attention, or judgment, the mind remembers that. Not consciously, but emotionally. And later in life, when something starts going well, that old association quietly returns. Not as a clear thought, but as a feeling, a subtle resistance. You might notice it in the way you delay finishing something important, or how you suddenly question your abilities right when things start to move forward, or how you create small distractions that slowly become bigger ones. It doesn't feel like you're choosing to sabotage anything. It feels like you're trying to stay comfortable. Because in a strange way, discomfort can feel safer than the unknown, even if the unknown is success. There's also something else underneath this. For some people, success isn't just about achievement, it's about identity. If you've spent most of your life seeing yourself as someone who struggles, or someone who is almost there, or someone who doesn't quite get what they want, that identity becomes familiar. And familiarity is powerful. So when something challenges that identity, even in a positive way, it can feel destabilizing. You might start to think, this isn't really me. This won't last. Something will go wrong. Not because you want it to fail, but because part of you doesn't fully recognize yourself in that version of success yet. And the mind tends to return to what it knows, even if what it knows is limiting. There's also the weight of expectation. Success doesn't just bring reward, it brings visibility, more responsibility, more pressure, more eyes. And for someone who learned early on to stay low, to not draw too much attention, to not make mistakes in front of others, that kind of visibility can feel overwhelming. So instead of stepping into it fully, you hesitate. You slow down. You create space between yourself and the outcome. Not because you don't want it, but because part of you is trying to protect you from what comes with it. Sometimes self-sabotage is less about failure and more about control. When things are uncertain, there's a quiet comfort in being the one who disrupts it first. Because if you're the one who pulls back, then you're not being pushed. If you lower your own expectations, then you don't have to face the possibility of falling short of someone else's. It's a subtle shift, but it changes the feeling completely. Instead of waiting for something to go wrong, you become the one who decides when it does. And that can feel safer, even if it costs you something. There's also the way the mind tries to avoid emotional contrast. If you've experienced disappointment before, especially after hope, you may have learned to soften your expectations,
to not fully lean into excitement, to hold back just a little, so that if things don't go well, it doesn't hurt as much. And over time, that holding back becomes automatic. You don't fully celebrate progress. You don't fully trust good moments. You stay slightly guarded. And that guard can quietly interfere with growth.
Because success often requires full engagement, and engagement requires a kind of openness. But openness can feel risky. So instead, you stay somewhere in between, close but not fully in, moving forward but with one foot slightly behind. And here's where it becomes even more subtle. Self-sabotage doesn't always look negative. Sometimes it looks like perfectionism, spending too long refining something until the moment passes, or constantly adjusting plans instead of acting on them, or setting standards so high that nothing ever feels ready. On the surface, it looks like care, like effort, but underneath it can be something else, a way to delay the moment where something becomes real, because once it's real, it can be evaluated, seen, judged, and that brings us back to something deeper. It's not always about the outcome itself, it's about what the outcome represents. To some people, success represents freedom. To others, it represents pressure, responsibility, expectation, exposure. And if your early experiences linked success with those heavier meanings, your mind doesn't just see success as something positive, it sees it as something complex, something that comes with trade-offs. So when you move toward it, you also move toward everything that comes with it. And part of you might not be ready for that, even if another part of you wants it. That internal split can create tension. You feel pulled in two directions at once. One part of you is moving forward, the other is holding back. And the result looks like inconsistency, like hesitation, like self-sabotage. But it's not random, it's patterned. And here's where it gets interesting. The behavior isn't always trying to stop you. Sometimes it's trying to slow you down, to regulate the pace, to make sure you're not stepping into something too quickly without feeling grounded in it. Because growth can feel disorienting. Becoming someone new, even in a positive way, can feel unfamiliar. And the mind tends to resist unfamiliar states, not because they're bad, but because they're new. It's like stepping into a larger room after being in a smaller one for a long time. Even if the room is better, it still takes time to adjust. Your sense of space changes, your sense of self shifts, and until that shift settles in, things can feel unstable. So the mind tries to restore balance, sometimes by pulling you back, sometimes by slowing things down, sometimes by creating small interruptions, not to harm you, but to regulate you. And once you begin to see it that way, something changes. The behavior stops looking like an enemy and starts looking like a signal that something unfamiliar is happening, that something is expanding, that your identity is being stretched beyond what it's used to, and that stretch can feel uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it's a sign that something is changing, that you're moving beyond an old version of yourself, even if part of you is still catching up to it. Over time, that gap between who you've been and who you're becoming starts to close. But while it's open, it can feel tension, like contradiction, like moving forward and backward at the same time. And that's where many people find themselves, not stuck, but in transition. It doesn't always look clear, it doesn't always feel steady, but it's not random, it's a process, a quiet adjustment, a recalibration of identity, and the behaviors that once looked like self-sabotage begin to make more sense. They were never just about failure, they were about familiarity, about protection, about pacing change in a way that felt manageable. And once you see that, you start to look at those moments differently,
not as proof that something is wrong with you, but as evidence that something deeper is happening, something internal, something patterned, something human. Because the mind doesn't just move toward what we want, it moves toward what it recognizes, and sometimes those two things take time to align. Until they do, there may be moments where you pause, where you hesitate, where you pull back just as things begin to move forward. But even those moments carry meaning. They point to where your past and your present are still learning how to exist together. And that's not failure. That's integration. And once you begin to understand that, the story shifts, not dramatically, but quietly. You stop seeing yourself as someone who ruins things and start seeing yourself as someone who is adjusting to something new, something unfamiliar, something that over time might begin to feel like you. And when that happens, the tension softens, the resistance becomes quieter, and the movement forward feels a little more natural. If this felt familiar to you, there's more to understand, and sometimes simply seeing the pattern is where that understanding begins. Understanding yourself is the beginning of everything.